12 bills. That's all the Massachusetts State Legislature has passed so far in this session, which, according to a review from the Boston Globe, makes this perhaps the least productive start to a legislative session in at least 40 years. By their count, the legislature is 5 or more bills behind the pace of the last 2 legislative sessions and close to half that of the average from the past 2 decades for this point on the calendar. So why exactly are lawmakers falling behind this time around? And is it a problem? The Globe reporter behind the story, Matt Stout, joins me now, along with GBH News State House reporter Katie Lannan. Thank you both for being here. Matt, how did you first get an inkling that the legislature is moving even more slowly this session than usual?
Basically, we try to do our best to track the bills, and it's something that's been sort of itching the back of my mind to the point where I'm like, well, what does it look like from past years? And then kept going back and back and back and could not find a year that there's been fewer at this point, and frankly just stopped at 1983 because it would have been more and more the farther you went back.
It drives the point home, right?
Yeah,
4 decades is a long time. Katie, is this something that has been on your radar, maybe that people are talking about in the building or outside the building, or that you just sense in the daily rhythms of the State House?
Absolutely. We've seen very few formal sessions this year, even though, you know, we're kind of back at a full strength operation after a couple pandemic disrupted years with remote sessions. But you don't see a lot of the busy early lawmaking activity. There is usually a slow start at the beginning of the session as lawmakers are assigned to committees, move into new offices, kind of the logistical things like that. But this year you can really see that, you know, thinking back to the last couple of sessions, there were COVID response bills that needed to be done.
Oh, that's a good point,
There hasn't been, other than some movement we've seen on tax reform, and of course the budget takes up a lot of the early action, the state budget. You haven't seen much other policy moving. It still feels like things are getting up and running, even though, you know, the session began in January and now here we are in June.
Did people think it was going to be that way with the Democrats taking back the corner office after 8 years of Charlie Baker, or did they expect, and when I say people, I guess I'm talking Democratic legislators, was there a hope that with a Democrat controlling the governorship now, that they would just be sort of forging ahead with dispatch, getting all sorts of stuff done?
Yeah, I think there's kind of 2 schools of thought there, right? And one is that there are a lot of advocates who are more hopeful that having Maura Healey in their corner office, who might be more sympathetic to their causes, more of an ally than former Governor Baker was, that, yeah, things would move. You know, you saw items in her campaign platform that people have been pushing for years now. But the other side of that coin is that when you have a full slate of Democratic control, you have the governor, the House, and the Senate, there's not really as clear a one singular force to set the agenda.
Oh, that makes sense. Matt, when you talk to defenders of the way things are working right now, and you talk to a few of them, what was the case they made for why this is not problematic?
Well, as the argument always is, I mean, it's set up to be a deliberative body and moving fast, especially when you have a session that is technically they have 19 months to do formal lawmaking. They are not going to rush, even if everyone agrees there is a big problem here or a big problem there. They have the time to address, to mull, to talk, do hearings, and they take it. This like sort of slow and steady, deliberate approach, it's something the legislature has always sort of embraced. It's just even this year, it's to even a degree than we've even seen before.
You know, I should be careful here because if any former bosses of mine or current bosses of mine are watching this segment, they may end up reminding me in a little bit that I like to take as much time as I can to finish a given job. And as you point out, the legislature has a lot of time to finish their job. But I would have thought that this sense of anxiety around people leaving Massachusetts, which seems to be more acute right now than I can remember it being in the past couple of decades, I would have thought that that might shake things up a little bit and get lawmakers saying, okay, yes, technically we have 19 months to do this, but there are real pressing problems that are making people move out every day or making people lose their homes every day. We got to move a little quicker this time around, but that's not happening.
Well, there's a tendency in the legislature to want to address big problems with big bills. They don't move a lot of small things. If there's sort of this umbrella, you know, say it's housing, say it's like they talk about competitiveness, which is sort of taking the form of the tax relief bill they're doing. They try to put a lot of different policy, a lot of different things into one big which takes time, which, I mean, and especially with the tax relief and sort of tax overhaul, that's eating up a lot of oxygen. And that's where those sort of like that energy has been. That hasn't been signed into law yet. We haven't even seen something from the Senate yet. But when you try and work through the budget, you're trying to work through that. I mean, that is taking up a lot of attention that essentially that is what they're working on behind the scenes.
And some of this stuff gets done in the budget, right? We should, since people, and I mean, you two are much more familiar with the sausage-making process than I am, but it's worth reminding people at home, sometimes these big ideas get hashed out in the budget itself, right?
Yes, definitely. And actually, you've seen a trend in the legislature over the past several years, not just to work on these big comprehensive packages, but to get things passed by getting them into the budget, which has to be signed into law every year. So maybe rather than passing a bill on one policy, you see the Senate or the House added in as an amendment, and they can kind of trade things in budget negotiations and get it to the governor that way. So that's one, rather than individual bills, that's one way they do try to move things forward.
We've talked about a couple of them, but what are some of the other big issues that are kicking around Beacon Hill, big ideas, maybe big pieces of legislation that have yet to be passed because things are moving as slowly as they are? Do any ideas spring to mind in addition to what we've already touched on? I mean, one thing I think of is the legislation that was rolled out last year that would remake the way Massachusetts approaches early childhood care. That still hasn't become a reality, right?
I absolutely was going to mention that one because there was a legislative commission last session, and that's one of the things that Governor Reilly has signaled support for. And so a lot of people have been hoping for movement there, but it really is, we haven't, seen a hearing yet. We haven't.
There hasn't even been a hearing on that one yet?
The hearings are still getting up and running, and I might be wrong that that hasn't had a hearing, but I don't know, Matt, if one is on your radar. But
I'm not sure if there's one specifically on that.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been hearings. Some of them have just been sort of oversight hearings where they like talk to people, issue ideas, but they're not sorting through bills yet.
Right.
I mean, in terms of other issues, you have housing. Everyone is, what do we do on housing? And we don't really know what the legislature is going to do yet. We don't know the timing of any type of legislation to address that. It seems like there is an appetite to do something, some major sort of omnibus bill on that. I mean, there's other things left over from last session too. They in light of the Supreme Court last year addressing gun laws, there's a need to address and change the laws here to reflect that and perhaps update it. That's something they talked about at the end of last summer, like, oh, hey, we're gonna do that when it comes to the new session. We are 5-6 months in, and we haven't seen movement on that either. But that's something that is also on their plate, on their radar.
Katie, I want to ask you to compare the situation in Massachusetts to Minnesota, which is where I happen to grow up, although I've lived here longer than I ever lived there. But Democrats in Minnesota took control of the Senate and the House and the governorship. They controlled all branches of government after the 2022 elections. And they responded by kind of going crazy to start off 2023. They passed a whole bunch. I can't list everything they passed here, but free public college tuition for families that earn under $80,000, restoring voting rights to formerly incarcerated people, universal free school lunches, banning non-competes, a whole mess of stuff. President Obama sent out a tweet Twitter thread recently praising what they did. I'll just quote from it briefly. If you need a reminder elections have consequences, check out what's happening in Minnesota. Earlier this year, Democrats took control of the state Senate by 1 seat after winning a race by just 321 votes. He went on to say in a subsequent tweet, since then, Minnesota's made progress on a whole host of issues, from protecting abortion rights and new gun safety measures to expanding access to the ballot and reducing child poverty. Long wind-up to ask you, is part of the reason things are moving so slowly here in Massachusetts that there is no sense among Democrats that their control is imperiled moving forward? Because in Minnesota, there's a tradition of Republicans being competitive. And here we've got quite the opposite. And it's trending in the opposite direction. Is that one reason that Democrats are so slow to act on everything we've been talking about here?
Yeah, I think you could make the case that for, large swaths of the state legislature, elections just don't have consequences. If you look at the general election here, over the past couple cycles, there's something like a third of the 200 legislative seats have competition in the general. And that's, candidates of all stripes, serious contenders and people who are kind of running on a lower profile campaign. And then if you back it up to the primary, it's typically only about half that have any sort of competition. So in primary or general. So there's really not much that people do to show a dissatisfaction with with this pace of the legislature. It remains to be seen if, something this session could generate a serious competitive force, if there's a reaction. I think it's worth noting that one of the jobs of legislative leaders is to protect their members, to kind of insulate them from tough votes. They do a lot to drive consensus behind major policies, to pass bills near unanimously rather than on a tight margin. So I think the specter of competition hangs over the head of the legislature.
They can imagine it maybe being competitive one day and it's spooky.
Yeah, if you look at the idea of, there's more Democrats in the House now than any session since 2009 before the Tea Party wave. And I think a lot of people remember being targeted with mailers, singling out specific votes, things like that. But, by and large, incumbents get reelected in Massachusetts, and that's particularly true of Democrats.
So, Matt, we've talked about political competitiveness or the lack thereof. You mentioned the amount of time they have in each session. Are there any other factors, structural factors, that you think might account for what you described in your piece?
Yeah, I think a lot of the pressures, whether it be electoral or not, that exist other places, don't exist here on a regular basis in Massachusetts. I mean, even, when you looked at the previous 8 years with the Republican governor and this idea that even Charlie Baker ran on of creating this friction between the legislature and the administration, Republican administration.
Productive and civil, but generative.
And there was some truth to that. There obviously was tension. And let's say there was never tension between, a Deval Patrick, a Democrat, and then a Democratic legislature. So I guess pick your issue and perhaps, you find your evidence there. But yeah, even with this current iteration with Maura Healey has gone out of her way not to create friction with the legislature, praising them. If things are moving slowly, she is not going to be the one to criticize them for that. I think as a new governor trying to settle in, but also create relationships, even if there were to be friction between all Democrats, it's not going to come from the corner office, at least as of now. At least we have not seen in the last 5 months or so.
That's a really interesting contrast, because when I think back to the Patrick years, and my mind is, I'm old enough that the memories are dim, but he came in with his own strong ideas about how business should be done, and he was, even though he was a Democrat, like most other legislators, he was an outsider, and he ruffled a lot of feathers, right? And this is a completely different vibe right now.
Yeah, even though Maura Healey has been in elected office statewide for 8 years before she's not an outsider by any means, especially compared to Deval Patrick. And I think she understands, and perhaps Deval Patrick is Democrats look back of like, well, that's there's things to avoid that happened during his time. That I'm not to say that Maura Healey's just looking back at news clippings of Deval Patrick's time and trying to learn the ropes. But I think there's you need to create relationships and not try to create too much friction with the legislature, because ultimately your agenda needs them on board to get done. A lot of your agenda, because there's only so much you could do as an executive without the legislature behind you.
All right, Matt Stout, Katie Lannan, thank you for talking this through. Appreciate it.
Thank you.